made it to session 6. I'm so impressed. Impressed that you've come this far in wanting to learn more about how you share the grace of God with the people that He has placed in your life. In fact, I am so impressed. Right here is my cell number and my email. You can text me, call me. I'm going to send you either a book or a coffee or hand sanitizer. Your choice. You tell me what you want. I'm going to send you something for getting to session 6 in Building the Bridges of Grace. We've been looking at this great book by Sam Chan. If you want that one, The Celtic Way of Evangelism. We're going to talk about another one today called Soul Searching. You tell me what book you want out of what you've seen. I'm going to send you that book for getting this far. But more than anything else, what getting this far into training on evangelism, a video training on evangelism, is that you really care about the people that God has placed in your life. Because that's really what it comes down to, is you love the people in your life, and you want more than anything else for those people to know the grace of God. And God's given us a mission. That's the Great Commission. One of the last things He said to His disciples, go into all the world and make disciples. And that's really the essence of what we're talking about here in Building Bridges of Grace. Not only building bridges from us to the people in our lives, but ultimately building bridges from those people to the God who loves them and the grace of His Son, Jesus Christ. All right, this session we're going to be talking about the cultural code. We have talked thus far about how important it is that we listen to the people in our lives, that we listen to our neighbors and those who don't know Jesus Christ, that we listen well to their perspective on life. And that's part of what this session is all about. There's a guy by the name of Christian Smith, along with a host of other researchers. He was one of the lead people. He's a sociologist at Notre Dame. And he did one of the largest surveys of young people and young adults. He basically tracked young people into young adulthood. So he did surveys with them, asked them questions in their teen years and then into their early 20s. And this is one of the things we're going to talk about today comes right out of that research, because Christian Smith says that one of the greatest challenges that Christianity faces in our culture and in our world today is what he calls moralistic therapeutic deism. I know that's a mouthful, but in essence, what moralistic therapeutic deism is all about is that it says moralism, that we have to be good people. Therapeutic, in other words, do what feels good or do what makes us happy. And deism is the idea that God is watching everything from a distance. He's set things in motion, He's created it, but He's watching. He's really not involved in our world. And that's the basic, even though people would never articulate it this way, this is the way the vast majority of our culture feels and thinks about God. It is ultimately an illness that is destroying God's big story. In other words, God's big story, in summary, is creation, fall, He covenants with His people, redemption through His Son, Jesus Christ, and then restoration, the restoration of all things, ultimately in the end. And that big story is being threatened by this creeping MTD, this moralistic therapeutic deism. And that's what we're going to kind of get into the details of that a little bit today, and probably next session too. It's an illness that lives inside the church as much as it lives outside the church. And we're going to see that too as we go along, that ultimately we in the church are practically living out some of the principles of moralistic therapeutic deism. And that it reminds us of the power. We ended last session a little bit talking about that word syncretism, how when we get so engaged and so connected and fall in love with the culture that we are a part of, that we lose the distinctiveness between what it means to be a follower of Christ in the culture and being a part of the culture itself, that flows together so much that we begin to compromise the true principles of what the Bible teaches and of Christianity, and it begins to morph into the culture. Now, my friend Larry Dornbos, going to give credit where credit is due. He organizes the principles of moralistic therapeutic deism around these 5 C's. He says, cars, candy, cafe, clouds, and creation. We're not going to get to all 5 of those today in this session, but we're going to get to hopefully 2 of them today in this session. And so let's just dive right in. The first one is creation. So moralistic therapeutic deism, these are just 5 things to hang our coat on as we think about these principles of what MTD is all about. And ultimately this comes back to how we listen to our culture. And these are things that if you listen well to your neighbors, these things are going to come through. You're going to hear these principles and these beliefs flowing through how they think and feel about the world. Because ultimately that's what a religion is. It's a worldview. It's how we approach the world. And for many people, this is an underlying principle through which they view the world. It's basically the idea that God exists, He created the world, and He set it in motion. Some of you may know that song by Bette Midler, God is watching us from a distance. I won't try to sing it, sorry. But anyway, you may know the song. If you don't look it up, listen to it. It's a beautiful song, and it's basically the idea that God is watching everything from a distance. It's got some other good concepts in there too, but this idea of deism permeates that song. And it permeates a lot of our culture, that most people do not believe that God is intimately involved with His creation. Most people on a practical basis as they go throughout their day, some within the church and some outside the church, believe that God's not a personal God that's intimately involved with us and with His creation. So with each one of these, we're going to say, how do we break the cultural code, and what are some of the challenges? How do we challenge the cultural code? If people think and feel this way, how do we help understand that? Every religion claims to be good for something, but they all claim to be good for different things. In other words, all religions have a goal in mind. But for each religion, that goal is something different. For Hindus, it's being joined with nirvana. It's this joining of all the souls. And in Buddhism, it's denying the things of this world in order to reach enlightenment. So how do we pull away from the material things of this world in order to reach enlightenment? For Islam, they have a concept of heaven and hell, but their understanding of heaven and hell and how you get to heaven is based on a strong moral code. And their idea of heaven is different than what the Christian views. So each one of the religions has their own concept of what it means to reach the goal and how things are coming together. All claim exclusivity. Their way is to get what they're offering. So the idea that every religion, and even those who are not religious, the atheists or the agnostics, all claim exclusivity. I had a conversation with some of my friends at a dinner one time, and they're not followers of Christ, and they know that I am, and so they started asking me questions. And it became clear to me in the conversation that tolerance was one of their greatest values. And that's a huge thing in our culture, is that people really value tolerance. But one of the key principles of tolerance is you can't claim to know the truth. Now that happens to be an intolerant, exclusive claim. Most people who value tolerance never see that part of it, but it is rationally untenable to hold that understanding of tolerance, to bring it to the point that you say you can't claim to know truth. And yet that's at the heart of a lot of tolerance. And that came through in our conversation, and I said, it strikes me that when you talk about math, when you talk about science, even psychology, chemistry, you look into any one of those fields of thought, and you're always going to search for and understand that there's a truth that you're looking for. There's an answer to the problem. However, when it comes to religion, people say, oh, there's no truth in religion. It's all true. It's shared. It's all equally right. It's all coexist. It's all leading to the same place. There's no right answer. That is rationally untenable. That should create cognitive dissonance for us and for people in the world, because if they really understood each religion's exclusive claims, they wouldn't think that way. It makes no sense at all. And it makes more sense that there is a truth, just as there is in math and science and chemistry and all these other fields. We're looking for the answers there. And we should do the same when it comes to religion. We should look for the truth in that. Here's the last thing. What makes Christianity different is that both what it claims to be good for, it is the restoration of all things. It is heaven and earth joined together and completely transformed. It's not just an individual going to heaven. It's not a joining with all the souls into some mystical presence. It is the transformation of all things. And the second unique part about Christianity is how we get there. Every other religion is ultimately, whether it's how we think rightly, Buddhism and finding enlightenment, it's a tough journey of thought and discipline. And it is always on the individual to attain the goal in every other religion. But in Christianity, it is by God's grace through faith alone. And that makes Christianity unique among the other religions of the world. So now, what about the challenge of the cultural code, syncretism? And we see this in the church too, that so often civil religion, nationalism is another term for that people begin to think in such a way that it's about America, and that the restoration of America somehow becomes equated with the restoration of Christianity. And folks, you're not going to find that in the Bible. It's just not there. And when this concept, this syncretism starts to permeate the church, and political aspirations and political emphasis start to overtake things, we've moved into this arena of nationalism, and it is a dangerous place for us to be. North American materialism as well. We see this in the church. There are a lot of churches out there that have combined some of the principles of Christianity with a desire for material wealth. We see that in what's called the health and wealth gospel, that there are a lot of teachers and preachers out there who talk about if you do the right things, if you give enough to the church, if you do this for the church, that you're going to be healthy and wealthy, that God wants you to be completely healthy and he wants you to be wealthy at the same time. And that is simply in contrast. It is complete opposition with what the Bible teaches us about what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ. A couple of other things. We lose the greatness of God that both heals and calls us to greater things, and we lose the wonder of the church as God's peculiar people. I'm going to keep moving. Cars. So creation is one thing, the deism. Cars is another thing. And cars is basically this idea, that God wants people to be good, nice, and fair to each other, as taught in the Bible and by most world religions. So in other words, ultimately, everybody, when you're driving a car, there's a code of ethics, right? You know when you get cut off, that person did the wrong thing. And that when you're a driver on the road, when you're driving your car, you should be nice. Right? You shouldn't cut people off. You should let people in. You should be a nice driver. And that's basically the essence of how a lot of people think about how to behave in this world. To be a good person. I'm a good guy. Right? And that's how most people approach. Just the other day in my front yard, one of the guys who walks the dog, and I see on a regular basis, he found out I was a pastor just recently and said, he says, I'm not really into religion. I'm just, I feel like we need to be a good person. And I think he represents so much of our culture that people take the approach, you just have to be a good person. So how do we break that cultural code? First off, not all the world's religions teach the same things about what it means to be human and how we value humanity. Hinduism, for example, as a built-in, for thousands of years, caste system, that there's a hierarchy, and it doesn't just go through humanity, it's in the reincarnation. That's why they preserve cows, that cows are going to be reincarnated, or if you live a bad life, you might go down the chain and end up as a cow or as a roach. But if you live a good life, then you're going to work your way up the chain in reincarnation. So it really changes how we think and feel about creation and how we think and feel about other people. In other words, if somebody is an outcast in Hindu culture, that's where they belong. There's less value on their lives, and that translates into how we treat each other. The same is true when it comes to how other religions feel. One of my friends is an atheist, and I talk with him at the bookstore when I go there, and he's a great guy, and he's a really good guy, and he says, hey, part of my mission in life is to do good things, to treat people well. And he is a good guy. But part of what he misses in the process, I think, is that he has no moral ground. Even Nietzsche, one of his heroes, said, atheists just need to own that they don't have a reason for their moral behavior. They can be good people, and many of them are. My friends who have atheists, very good people, but they don't have any moral ground from which to work from. Nietzsche says if an atheist claims to have moral ground to work from, he's borrowing it from a Christian culture. Because ultimately it's in the Christian culture that has the greatest ground for moral behavior. Not the only, there are moral grounds in other religious beliefs too. But let me give you one more example. Langdon Gilkey was taken prisoner in a Japanese prison camp called Shantung Compound. And Langdon Gilkey was a humanist. One of the highest values of human life in humanism. Humanism sometimes even raises humanity to the level of a god. And Langdon Gilkey felt that when the chips are down, people will do the right thing. And then he ended up in Shantung Compound, and there was space, where they lived. There were incredibly cramped quarters, and people were having trouble sleeping and even just surviving because it was so cramped. And then the quarters where he was living in had 9 people. The one next door had 11, and they had gone down. They had had 10 before, and now they were down to 9. And he just knew that all the people that in his place where he were living were going to say, no, we have room. Let one of the people from that one come over here. And the opposite was true. They were not going to give an inch to the person who needed it. In spite of his understanding of humanism, it didn't play out practically when the chips were down. But what he came to find out with those who followed a God that was willing to sacrifice himself and his son for others, that people who followed that understanding of following Jesus Christ, taking up their cross daily, that they were the ones who somehow found a key to moral behavior in this world. And ultimately, when it comes to, this idea of being a good person, being a nice neighbor, Christianity calls us to something so much more, something far beyond just being a good person. That it calls us to sacrifice, to do justice, to love mercy, to walk humbly with God, and to take up our cross daily and walk with Him. Ultimately, where that kind of lifestyle leads us, and I'm going to wrap up with this because my time is done, but ultimately where this leads us often with this idea of just being a good person in our world, that culture pushes us in this direction of shrinking our world, that our world becomes very small. And that's what happens when we want to punish somebody. What do we do with them? We put them in solitary confinement. If we want to punish them more, we insulate them, take out light and sound and all those things, and we punish them even more. And how that plays out in the Christian life and in life in general is that Jim Martin from International Justice Mission tells a story of going over to a friend's house for Bible study, and they were somewhat wealthy people in our culture, and they had just redone the bathroom. And she was anxious about having people over for small group because it wasn't finished yet. And actually, the whole job had been finished. But when it was done, she said it just wasn't right. She said it was the grout. the grout was all wrong. So they tore the whole thing out and they were starting over. And you watch HGTV for any length of time, you'll see this. They walk into houses all the time, into beautiful homes. This is horrible. And sometimes I try to watch it from the perspective of the billion people who live on $1 a day or less. And, living with dirt floors and walk into a home like that and say, oh, this is horrible. They would say, this is a mansion. Right? But we've shrunk our world where we're isolated and insulated from the brokenness and the hurting. And part of what Jim Martin says is followers of Christ were meant to live in life and death situations. That God calls us into places where life and death are on the line. It's not about just being a good person. It's about going beyond to love the people who are broken in this world. And folks, we don't have to go very far to find those people. They're right here in our neighborhoods. And some of them look really good, and they have some measure of wealth, but inside they are broken. And part of our call is to find those folks who are hurting and broken in our world and in life and death situations, and bring the grace and the hope of Jesus Christ to those situations. We'll pick up here next time. Thanks a lot for tuning in.